As I grew up, one of my favourite films was Ocean's 11. It's a remake of an older movie of the same name in which George Clooney and Brad Pitt rob a Las Vegas casino by formulating an absurdly complex plan with multiple moving parts. My child brain thought it was brilliant. But as I got older, smarter, and generally more cynical, the glaring and almost insultingly obvious holes in the plan became clear to me. If one were to actually rob a casino, or a bank, or anything else, a strategy like this would rely on entirely too many things going exactly according to plan. In reality, a straightforward operation, with as few variables as possible, is your best bet. And this principle applies to most things. Ask anyone who's ever had to coordinate a big project or organize a large event, and they'll tell you that simplicity is your friend. Because when you complicate things, you're not only making everything harder to keep track of, but you're also multiplying the number of things that can go wrong. Hello again, and welcome to what will, after all of this, be well over 2 hours worth of YouTube content about the potential causes of the Late Bronze Age collapse. So far we've looked at a fair few potential theories. We've seen the sea peoples and how they might have taken down the Late Bronze Age, natural disaster, internal feuding between the states, but none of them that we can convincingly point out and say, yes, you have the power to destroy the Late Bronze Age world. So today, let's take a look at a theory that began in the 1970s and has since increased in popularity to the extent that most historians subscribe to it in some way or another. Systems collapse. So, to understand systems collapse, imagine that you are the monarch of some fictional state set in the past. Your country is quite a small one, and your population is fairly small, and it relies mostly on subsistence farming to survive. Things are going fairly well, but they're not perfect. Your upriver neighbour, King Shibby-Doopy-Doopy, is a dick. And every year he pops across the border to raid and nick your stuff, which is a problem, not only because he's stealing wealth from your lands, but because your people, who you lead, rely on you to keep them safe. And if you can't do that, they might start shopping around for a new leader. So, to solve this problem, you gather up some money and you pay a neighbouring state to buy some horses and some chariots, and you start training up a chariot elite, a group of warriors who can respond quickly to any raids. Something that might make these people think twice about coming into your territory. But you've just created a new problem. This chariot class is going to be an ongoing expense for you, something you have to keep paying for. Not only for the chariots themselves, which are expensive, and the men who need to train for years to know how to use them, but also the horses that pull them, which require land to graze on, land that can no longer be used for crops or animals that you can eat. So your poor people are now struggling to feed themselves. But luckily there's a solution to this too. The fields that are being used for subsistence agriculture can instead be used to grow olives to make olive oil with. Now your people can't live off olive oil no matter how hard they try, but they can put it on ships and sell it to your neighbours, making you money which you can then use to buy food imports from other places that are more agriculturally rich. Now it might seem like what you have here is a pretty successful little kingdom. Your trade is prospering, your people are growing more and more wealthy, they're enjoying luxury foreign goods from far, far off lands, and they've got an increased feeling of security because of that nifty little army that you've paid for. And all of this has led to you demanding more and more respect from your allies and neighbours. But all of this success might blind you to the fact that these problems here haven't gone away. Your neighbour may no longer be an immediate threat to you, but he's still there with a chariot army of his own, just waiting for an opportunity. And your people may be importing food in record numbers, but they still can't feed themselves in a time of crisis. Much like George Clooney and Brad Pitt, you're relying on everything going exactly right and according to plan, which doesn't allow for things that are sometimes outside of your control. What happens if your ally who provides you with these food shipments is overthrown one day by a new regime, a regime that is less friendly to you? Or what if he even just suffers a drought and his agricultural yield that year isn't particularly good and he can barely feed his own people, he can't afford to export food to you just for a bit of cash? Or what if one day you get a bit risky with your warfare? Remember that war is an integral part of being a monarch at the time. Not only do you have to keep your people safe, you're probably going to have to get some of the riches to pay for your land by going to other people's territory and raiding them. But what if one day you suffer a huge military defeat and most of your expensive chariot class is wiped out? That's going to be expensive and time-consuming to make a new one, and in that time you're vulnerable to that not-so-friendly neighbour upriver. And soon your very strong kingdom might not seem as strong as it did to start with. In fact, what you have are just problems that increase in complexity, as do the solutions, until your state looks like a Jenga tower, one that's getting so tall that it might be impossible to knock one block out without bringing the whole thing down. And what happens if, say, that neighbour from upriver comes and actually destroys you? Well, it's lights out for you and your kingdom, which is bad enough. But what about your allies? Allies who might have become increasingly dependent on your exports from this agricultural gold mine you've created. What happens when their merchants come back empty-handed because there's no one left to trade with? Well, what might happen is their own state falls on hard times. And then before you know it, the collapse of your Jenga tower has led to the collapse of someone else's Jenga tower, which could go on forever like a domino effect of Jenga towers. And this idea, if applied to these kingdoms here, is the essence of the systems collapse theory. The idea that what made the Late Bronze Age so spectacular, its huge trade circuit, its complex systems, its concert of diplomacy, and its well-organized workforce and class structure, were also the things that sowed the seeds of its inevitable collapse. Within the systems collapse theory, there are two main schools of thought. They're not really opposed to each other, it more just has to do with how you view the Bronze Age world to begin with. There are those, like one of the theory's pioneers, a guy called Joseph Tainter, who saw the Late Bronze Age world as a good system that got increasingly more and more complex, until one day the Jenga tower grew too high, a block was knocked out, and the whole thing came crashing down. So he probably saw this as an inherently practical system, but one that got out of hand. In this explanation, the Bronze Age world falls apart as a result of increasing over-reliance on the trade circuit, population pressures, and unsustainable farming practices. That this was a practical system that got out of hand and couldn't withstand the pressures applied by the increasing disasters of the late 13th century. And then there's the second way of viewing systems collapse. Scholars like Liverani and Monroe see it this way, that this was an inherently bad and unstable system, one that wouldn't have survived even in a universe without as many pressures being applied to it. This is like the theory that if you build a Jenga tower tall enough, you don't have to play the game for it to fall over, it will just fall over on its own. Liverani, for example, blames the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization on the very structure of their society, one in which the entire population of Greece was tied to the palace from which all decisions were made. So in this structure, if the palace is thrown into chaos because of internal feuding or some trouble in the royal family, there is no other institution capable of taking on the mantle of responsibilities, because no other institution has any responsibilities. It's all always been done from the palace. Monroe, on the other hand, argued that the entire Bronze Age world fell apart because all of these states were completely over-reliant on bronze. Now, I know this is beginning to sound a bit like the highly discredited, and rightfully so, ironworking hypothesis, but stick with me here. Back in the first episode of this series, I discussed how all of these great Bronze Age states were completely dependent on the metal, and the metal itself was an alloy of copper and tin. And not one of these states had within their borders a mine for both copper and tin. Very few of them even had one. So what happens if there's a copper shortage? Or if one of these kings just decides one day, you know what, I'm not going to share anymore. These people need bronze for everything. They need them for their weapons to keep them safe. They need them for their tools to farm with. Bronze is everything. It's called the Bronze Age, for God's sake. Okay, so now you've gotten the gist of systems collapse. It's less an answer to the question of why did the late Bronze Age world fall apart, and more a way of looking at the question. One that doesn't involve needing to subscribe to one specific explanation. And you know, it's quite a lot of fun. So before we go about tearing at a new one, as is the solemn duty of all historians, let's have a look at some of the ways that systems collapse has been used to explain the end of the Bronze Age. Colin Renfrew made a case for systems collapse back in 1979, and his explanation goes a little something like this. So in this story, the boogeyman of the ancient Near East, the widow factory that was Assyria, attacked the Hittites in the late 13th century. They defeat the Hittite king and raid around for a little bit. This huge setback for the empire's military emboldens the Kashka people of the north to attack Hattusa, which they do with more success than they could have ever reasonably expected. And they, probably by accident, permanently cripple the ability of the Hittites to administer their empire. And without the centralized government, which had made all of those deals with Egypt and the cities of Syria to supply food, famine strikes the lands that had once enjoyed the empire's protection. These starving and desperate people then attack their better-off neighbors for the limited resources of the land and become the Sea People that we know and love. Nancy Sanders, who literally wrote the book on the Sea Peoples, very much incorporates them into systems collapse. So in her view, they are still the biggest factor, the final domino in the domino effect. But the total collapse was brought on by the fact that the artificial and fragile ways of life in the palaces of the late Bronze Age world were simply not equipped to take the strain of something like this. Phil Betancourt made an argument that the population of Greece was rapidly increasing, and by the turn of the 12th century it was so high that even a minor food shortage or a brief interruption in international trade could bring about the collapse of the whole system, and that the collapse of the Mycenaeans was simply the first domino to be pushed over, leading to the collapse of everyone else. A fellow called Gordon Shrimpton built on this idea, saying that not only was the Mycenaean population increasing, but the amount of food they were making was decreasing. Not just because the soil was becoming less fertile and rainfall was becoming less common, but because in order to obtain the luxury goods that the Mycenaeans really desired, the prestige goods, the silk shoes and the gold jewelry, they were focusing more and more on growing olive oil and wine instead of, grain and things to feed themselves. These were much more profitable, like cash crops. But obviously when shortage hit, or when they could no longer import enough food, this led to widespread starvation and therefore desperation, leading many of the Mycenaeans to become the first wave of Sea Peoples, and before you know it, you have complete collapse. And these are just a few of the literally hundreds of narratives that different historians have proposed under the umbrella theory of systems collapse. So, those are just some of the explanations born of the systems collapse theory. And they're pretty good, eh? I mean, I definitely reckon so. They certainly solve one of the main problems that we've been dealing with in this series of videos, which is that none of these explanations on their own are convincing enough to have brought about the Bronze Age collapse. Systems collapse makes us look at the entire event differently. In an analogy that I've used several times this video, it's like the domino effect, with the dominoes gradually increasing in size until one falls over that's big enough to permanently squish the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Canaanites, etc. And it's less about arguing which domino crushed which bit of the Bronze Age, and more about seeing it as a chain reaction. But the systems collapse theory fails to escape another great overarching problem with studying this era, which is that there's a complete lack of evidence, and that through necessity, every explanation for the Bronze Age collapse must be based on wild assumptions, the kind that no serious historian would ever dare publish if they had access to anything other than the bare minimum amount of evidence. Despite the fact that I've now made upwards of 2 hours worth of YouTube content about it, we actually know incredibly little about the late Bronze Age, and the evidence that we do have is very limited in scope and not very diverse. I mean, there is the tiny percentage of stuff that survives over thousands of years for archaeologists to then find and dig up, and then the rest of it is mostly royal propaganda, statues and inscriptions and basically kings talking about how excellent and fantastic they are, which isn't really very helpful to us because we're after evidence as to what was going wrong in their countries at the time, and that's not the kind of thing that leaders and monarchs usually like to advertise. As a result, like I say, we've got very limited evidence, so limited in fact that not a single one of the explanations we've explored so far would ever hold up in a court of law. So instead, historians are kind of working on a puzzle for which most of the pieces are missing, And even though systems collapse can help compensate for the lack of evidence and give a bit of structure to this thing, we can't let it fool us into thinking that it's giving us a whole picture. It's most certainly not. Robert Drews is very critical of systems collapse for another reason. He says it's like talking about the collapse of the Inca Empire and going into all of the inherent weaknesses and structural problems with Inca society, but failing to ever mention the Spanish. Or how about this? Imagine there is a 60-year-old patient in a hospital and he gets pneumonia and he dies. Now, this guy has drank, smoked, ate nothing but cheeseburgers, and never exercised his entire life. He's basically lived a lifestyle seemingly designed to destroy his own health. Now, the systems collapse theory would explain his death by being like, oh, well, his lung capacity was reduced by such and such, and his immune system was compromised by the blah, blah, blah. And yes, probably contributing factors, but the cause of death was not poor life choices. The cause of death was pneumonia. And the point that Drews makes is that we can talk all day about how poor life choices and poor health might have helped contribute to this man's demise, but it's not an explanation on its own, because sometimes perfectly healthy people die of pneumonia. Eric Klein, despite saying that systems collapse is a very useful way to look at an event about which we know quite little, still criticizes it, asking, is it just stating the incredibly obvious, which is that complicated systems with lots of moving parts can go wrong in a variety of ways. And of course, the very complexity which could lead to a systems collapse also gets in the way of it being a satisfying explanation. I mean, when you point out that there are 1,000 things that could have gone wrong in the late Bronze Age, all you're really doing is laying the groundwork for 1,000 arguments about which of them was the most important and which caused what, which was symptomatic of the other. Or was it all of them happening at once by complete chance? Well, maybe. I mean, this is the idea that Eric Klein kind of endorses towards the end of his book in his last chapter, Perfect Storm of Calamities, in which he argues that it's not really important what came first or what factor led to what or what was causational and what was symptomatic. What was important is that around the year 1190, all of them were happening at once. And this was entirely too much strain for the late Bronze Age world to take. Less looking at it as a domino effect and trying to figure out which was the first domino to fall, and more focusing on the important thing being that all of the dominoes were falling at the same time and no one could catch them. So I guess that leaves us with no solid answer. When I made the first video in this series a couple of months ago, I made a promise that I would succeed where all others had failed, and I would find a definitive explanation for what killed off the Bronze Age. And I failed spectacularly, which should be a shock to absolutely no one. Regardless, I hope you've enjoyed exploring these most popular explanations, and we haven't even covered half of them, by the way. This is a huge subject. So before I leave you, I'd like to share the personal conclusion that I came to at the end of all of this, and perhaps a few final thoughts on the late Bronze Age collapse. So, here's the explanation that I find the most likely and the most probable, and I'm certain it's not an original idea, but I couldn't find anyone to cite, so sorry. So in the first video I did, we looked over all the different states, kingdoms and empires of the late Bronze Age, but I've also often been referring to it as if it were a single entity, something that we've been calling the Bronze Age world. And this is because even though it's made up of separate kingdoms and empires who run themselves with their own government and their own royal families, they're so interconnected and interreliant on one another that they can kind of be viewed as one thing. And all of these separate royal families and royal houses can be viewed as being like an extended family. Hell, they talk about each other like they're an extended family, maintaining perfect balance over this world, basically. And all of them were completely reliant on the main characteristic of this world, which is its huge trade network. All of them needed bronze, which none of them could make on their own. Many of them needed food imports, and those that exported food were reliant on the income they made from it to pay for their armies and their infrastructure, etc. But although each one of these kingdoms has their own centralized, autocratic, big government, no one's managing the entire Bronze Age world. There's no great overseer, no great hegemon to make sure that the whole system is constantly working. And it's here that I think we can see the seeds being sown for an eventual collapse, which I think starts in the late 13th century with the Hittite Empire beginning to lose control over some of its vassals. These vassals and allies who have always perhaps been the less reliable and the less loyal of them start turning to activities like piracy and raiding in order to make a little bit more for themselves. And hell, one of the victims of this increased piracy could have been that Uluburun wreck that George Bass excavated back in the 1980s. And there was probably a retaliation to this increase in piracy and raiding. For example, Ugarit, we know at the turn of the 12th century, is sending ships to the lands of Lucca, quite possibly to deal with this. But whatever response came, it was too late to prevent a hiccup in the trade network. The merchants from Canaan and Egypt who had to go via this route to get to the Aegean either no longer went or no longer went in the same numbers that people were used to, because it was simply too dangerous. And this interruption in trade, no matter how brief, was disastrous for the Mycenaeans in Greece, who began to suffer a horrific food shortage on top of the sequence of earthquakes that their land was going through at the time. As a result, the now desperate Greeks start looking for new means of acquiring the resources they need, now that they can no longer get it reliably through trade. So they start raiding and pirating themselves, heading eastwards. At the same time, the Kashgar people of the north of Anatolia have been emboldened by the lack of Hittite strength and have marched southwards, burning the capital of Hattusa and causing the Hittite Empire to permanently disintegrate. And the destructive path caused by migrators, raiders and pirates, that we can probably start calling the Sea People from here on out, finally reaches Syria and the Levant. Here they burn some of the cities, they settle amongst the other lands, and some of them continue to raid south, eventually hitting Egypt, where they will be turned back by Ramses III and his army. And so you have eventual collapse. Or at least that's my favourite theory, one that I will probably change multiple times in the remaining years I have on this planet. After all, like I said, the puzzle is incomplete, but new pieces are appearing all of the time. So, what is the takeaway from the collapse? Well, one might be that no matter how advanced your civilization, you are never safe, and that human history is not a story of constant progression forward. As a species, we are regularly knocked back a couple of pegs, and we in the modern age are not immune to this either. Of course, with billions more people and the technology to destroy ourselves intentionally or unintentionally, we are currently playing with considerably higher stakes than the Mycenaeans or the ancient Egyptians were, but, well, there's actually no but, that's just a terrifying thought. The trouble is, there's not really a moral to pin down from the late Bronze Age collapse, because what lesson you think it teaches us depends entirely on what theory you buy into regarding why it happened. Or, there's the great overarching one, which is beware of unforeseen catastrophes, which is a terrible lesson. And if you think it's the very complexity of these societies that led to their collapse, i.e. if you buy into the systems collapse theory, what exactly is the solution? Never create a complex society? I mean, if you never have a complex society, what you basically have is the post-collapse world. What kind of a solution is that? That's like saying never become rich, because you might lose it all. I mean, if you lose it all, you're just back at the same situation you were at before you got rich. Instead, knowing all this might just condemn you to look at civilization less as a fixed, permanent thing, and more like a stock market, constantly going up and down until one day it inevitably crashes. And when it does, provided we survive that, we will do what human beings always do, which is to rebuild and recover, no matter how long it takes, so that we might repeat the cycle once again. Although the only lesson I take from this is the same one given to me at the chronological end of the iconic Walking With trilogy. For those of you that don't know, this trilogy was a BBC series about the evolution of animals before, during, and after the dinosaurs. And it was incredible. Like, the best television possibly ever. And at the end of the final episode of the Walking with Beasts series, after the Ice Age is over, the narrator says, "If all this has taught us anything, it's this. No species lasts forever." So maybe that's the lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Thank you all for watching.